Hi, I'm Carmen, and last Thanksgiving, I spent 14 hours cooking a feast for 23 people while my family watched football in the living room. When I finally sat down to eat, my plate was cold, my back was screaming, and my sister Brittany was live streaming herself taking credit for the family recipes I'd been perfecting for years. That was the moment I realized I wasn't the family cook. I was the family servant. So I walked out, leaving behind the turkey, the traditions, and the people who took my love for granted. What happened next changed everything. And now they're the ones begging for an invitation to my table. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The steam from the roasting pan fogged up my glasses as I bent over the oven, checking the turkey for the third time in an hour. 6 in the morning, and I was already 3 hours into what would become the longest day of my life. The kitchen smelled like sage and butter, onions and garlic, the kind of warm, rich aromas that should have filled me with holiday joy. Instead, my stomach churned with that familiar knot of dread that had been my Thanksgiving companion for as long as I could remember. From the living room, I could hear the distant chatter of the morning news and my father's occasional grunt of approval at whatever political commentary was floating through the speakers. Mom's voice drifted in from the dining room, where she was no doubt rearranging the centerpiece for the fourth time, making sure everything looked Pinterest perfect for when the family arrived. Nobody had offered to help, nobody ever. I pulled the turkey out, golden and glistening, and set it on the cooling rack. 22 pounds of heritage bird that had cost me 2 weeks' worth of grocery money, but it was worth it. It always. These moments in the kitchen when it was just me and the food and the quiet satisfaction of creating something beautiful were the only times I felt like I belonged in this house. My phone buzzed against the counter. A text from Brittany, sent from upstairs in her childhood bedroom, where she was probably still lounging in bed. Can you make extra stuffing? Todd's bringing his parents and they love carbs. You're amazing at this stuff. Heart emoji, chef emoji, prayer hands emoji. I stared at the message, my jaw tightening. She'd mentioned Todd's parents yesterday in passing, like it was no big deal. 2 extra people, 2 more mouths to feed with ingredients I'd already bought and planned for. 2 more plates to wash, 2 more chairs to squeeze around a table that was already packed tight. But sure, Carmen can handle it. Carmen always handles it. I typed back a simple okay and slid the phone across the counter, harder than necessary. The cornbread was cooling on the wire rack, the cranberry sauce was simmering on the stove, and I still had 7 side dishes to finish before noon. My lower back ached from standing, and I hadn't even started on the mashed potato. The kitchen door swung open, and Mom breezed in wearing her good jewelry and a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. She surveyed my workspace with the critical eye of a food critic, taking in the controlled chaos of mixing bowls, cutting boards and simmering pots. "How's it coming along, Mija?" she asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't really interested in an honest answer. She opened the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of white wine, checking the label like she was seeing it for the first time. "This should pair nicely with dinner." Brittany picked it out. Of course she did. Brittany, who was still asleep while I'd been up since 3 in the morning prepping vegetables and seasoning the turkey. Brittany, who would waltz downstairs in an hour looking effortlessly beautiful and ready for her close-up, because she'd planned some sort of social media content around today's gathering. "It's going fine," I said, testing the consistency of the gravy with a wooden spoon. "Everything should be ready by 2. Perfect. The Hernandezes are coming early to help set up. And you know how Tia Rosa gets when things aren't just so." Mom paused by the stove, lifting the lid on the cranberry sauce and inhaling deeply. "This smells incredible. You really outdid yourself this year." The compliment should have warmed me, but it felt hollow. She said the same thing every year, right before disappearing back into the living room to play hostess while I finished the last 6 hours of cooking alone. It was our annual dance, this pretense that we were in this together, that this was a family effort. "I added orange zest this time," I said, stirring the sauce, "and a little cardamom." Fancy. "Well, I'll let you get back to it. Let me know if you need anything." And then she was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of her expensive perfume and the weight of another day where my contributions would be consumed, praised and then forgotten. I turned back to the stove, cranking up the heat under the pot of potatoes. At least the food wouldn't let me down. By 10:30, the kitchen looked like a hurricane had blown through it. Every burner was occupied, the oven was full, and I was juggling timers like a short-order cook during the breakfast rush. The sweet potato casserole was bubbling away, the green bean amandine was staying warm in the slow cooker, and I was elbow-deep in mashing potatoes when Brittany finally made her appearance. She swept into the kitchen like she was walking a red carpet, her hair perfectly blown out and her makeup flawless despite having just woken up. She wore a rust-colored sweater dress that hugged her curves in all the right places, and boots that probably cost more than I made in a month. Even first thing in the morning, Brittany looked like she belonged in a lifestyle magazine. "Good morning, beautiful," she sang, heading straight for the coffee maker. "Oh my God, it smells incredible in here. You're seriously the best." She pulled out her phone and started snapping photos of the food, adjusting angles and lighting like she was documenting a professional photo shoot. I watched her work, feeling invisible even though I was standing 3 feet away, sweat beading on my forehead from the heat of the kitchen. "This is going to make such good content," she murmured, focusing her camera on the golden turkey. "My followers are obsessed with authentic family traditions. They're going to die over these colors." "Maybe mention that it took me 8 hours to make," I said, more sharply than I intended. Brittany glanced up from her phone, blinking like she'd forgotten I was there. "Oh, totally. I'll definitely give you credit. You know I always do." But she didn't. Every year she posted beautiful photos of our Thanksgiving spread, with captions about family recipes passed down through generations, and the magic of gathering together. She tagged the location, tagged her outfit, tagged everyone except the person who'd actually cooked the food. Her followers saw a perfectly curated holiday moment, not the reality of one person doing all the work while everyone else took the credit. "Brittany, can you please help me move these dishes to the warming trays?" I asked, gesturing to the growing collection of completed sides. "Of course. Let me just finish this story real quick." She held up her phone, recording herself with the kitchen as a backdrop. "Good morning, gorgeous souls. It's Thanksgiving morning, and I'm in my family's kitchen where the magic is happening. There's something so grounding about connecting with your roots. You know, about honoring the traditions that make us who we are." I turned back to the potatoes, gripping the masher harder than necessary. Connecting with your roots, honoring tradition, all while I stood there sweating over a hot stove, invisible in her frame. "The energy in here is just incredible," she continued to her phone. "There's so much love going into this meal. I can literally feel my ancestors smiling down on us." The ancestors who'd passed down their recipes to me, not her. The ancestors whose traditional techniques I'd spent years learning and perfecting while Brittany was off building her personal brand. "But sure, let's talk about ancestral connection while I did all the work." "Okay, done." She tucked her phone away and finally looked at me. "What can I help with?" I gestured to the stack of serving dishes. "Can you start moving the finished stuff to the dining room? The sweet potatoes are ready, and the stuffing just needs to stay warm." "Absolutely." She picked up the sweet potato casserole, holding it carefully so as not to disturb her manicure. "This looks amazing, by the way. Did you try that maple bourbon glaze I suggested?" I had tried it actually. Had spent an hour last night reducing real maple syrup with a splash of good bourbon until it was the perfect consistency. Had glazed the sweet potatoes twice to get that beautiful caramelized finish that would photograph so well. But hearing her take credit for the idea made my chest tighten. "Yeah, it turned out great," I said simply. "I knew it would. I have such a good eye for flavor profiles. It's probably all those cooking shows I watch." The cooking shows she watched while I was actually cooking. The food blogs she scrolled through while I was testing recipes. The Instagram accounts she followed while I was shopping for ingredients and planning menus and doing the actual work of feeding our family. She ferried the dishes to the dining room one by one, and I could hear her narrating each trip for another Instagram story, bringing out these incredible sides that have been simmering all morning. The aromatherapy in here is off the charts. Aromatherapy, as if the hours of careful cooking were just ambient mood enhancement rather than skilled labor. By 11:30 the first wave of family had arrived. I could hear voices in the living room, the sound of hugs and greetings and compliments on how wonderful everything smelled. Dad's booming laugh echoed down the hallway, and I caught fragments of conversation about football and work and Brittany's latest social media success. Nobody came into the kitchen to say hello, nobody offered to help with the final hour of preparation. They were all content to let the magic happen behind the scenes while they caught up and relaxed and enjoyed their holiday. I was the invisible engine that made their gathering possible, and they all seemed perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. I pulled the dinner rolls out of the oven, golden and steaming, and started arranging them in a cloth-lined basket. My phone buzzed with a notification, and I glanced at the screen to see that Brittany had tagged me in an Instagram story. Curious despite myself, I opened it up. She'd posted a boomerang of herself holding the sweet potato casserole, the camera catching the golden glaze as she tilted the dish back and forth. The caption read, "Family recipe magic happening. So grateful for the women who came before us and the traditions they passed down. Nothing tastes like home, bless. Family first. Thanksgiving traditions." I stared at the screen, something cold and hard settling in my stomach. Family, recipe magic, traditions passed down. Not a single mention of the fact that I'd been up since 3 in the morning making that magic happen. Not a word about the hours of planning and shopping and cooking that went into every dish. Just vague gratitude for the women who came before us, as if the food had materialized through ancestral blessing rather than my labor. The kitchen door swung open again, and this time it was Tia Rosa, Dad's sister, carrying an empty casserole dish and wearing a sympathetic smile. "Mija, you look exhausted," she said, setting her dish on the counter and pulling me into a quick hug. "Have you eaten anything today?" The question caught me off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked if I was taking care of myself during these marathon cooking sessions? I realized I'd been running on coffee and adrenaline since dawn, too focused on everyone else's needs to think about my own. "I'm fine," I said automatically, "just trying to get everything finished on time. Let me help you with something. What needs to be done?" The offer was so unexpected, so genuinely kind, that I almost teared up. "Actually, could you help me carve the turkey? I need to get the gravy finished and the table set, and I'm running out of hands." "Of course, baby. You go do what you need to do." As Tia Rosa expertly carved the turkey, chatting about her own Thanksgiving preparations, and asking about my job and my life outside of this kitchen, I realized how starved I was for this kind of basic consideration. Someone who saw me as a person rather than just a cooking service. Someone who noticed that I might need help, might need a break, might need to eat something before I collapsed. I finished the gravy and started loading dishes onto serving platters, my movements automatic and efficient from years of practice. Through the doorway I could see the dining room filling up with family members, everyone dressed in their holiday best and holding drinks and laughing. Brittany was in the center of it all, of course, regaling everyone with stories about her latest business ventures and upcoming collaboration. "The wellness retreat I'm planning for next spring is going to be absolutely transformational," she was saying, gesturing with her wine glass. "I'm partnering with this incredible chef who specializes in plant-based indigenous cuisine, and we're going to do these amazing workshops on mindful eating and ancestral nutrition." From the girl who considered cereal a food group and survived primarily on protein bars and green smoothies, but her audience was eating it up, nodding and asking questions about dates and pricing, like they were genuinely interested in signing up for her latest venture. "Carmen," Mom's voice called from the dining room, "is everything ready? People are getting hungry." I looked around the kitchen at the spread I'd created. 23 dishes, each one perfectly seasoned and beautifully presented. Hours of work, thousands of calories, enough food to feed our extended family with leftovers for days. All of it ready to be consumed and enjoyed while I retreated back to the kitchen to start washing dishes. "Coming," I called back, loading the last few platters onto a serving cart. As I wheeled the cart into the dining room, a small cheer went up from the assembled family. "Here she is, our master chef," Uncle Miguel called out, raising his beer in a mock toast. "Carmen, this looks incredible." The compliments washed over me as I arranged the dishes on the table, everyone praising the presentation, and the smells and asking about various recipes. For a moment I let myself bask in the recognition, the acknowledgement of all the work I'd put in. This was why I did it, wasn't? For these moments of appreciation, for the satisfaction of bringing everyone together around food I'd made with love. But as I stepped back from the table surveying the feast I'd created, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. Every seat was filled. 23 chairs around the extended table, 23 place settings, 23 cloth napkins, folded just so, and there was no place for me. "Where am I sitting?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. Mom looked up from adjusting the centerpiece, blinking in confusion. "Oh, I'm sorry, honey. I didn't realize we were short a chair. Can you grab one from the kitchen?" I stared at her, processing what had just happened. She'd counted wrong, 23 place settings for 24 people, and she'd forgotten to include me. The person who'd cooked every bite of food on that table had been forgotten in the seating arrangement. "Actually," Brittany piped up, "Todd's parents couldn't make it after all. Something about his mom's back acting up, so we should have plenty of room." 21 people then, 21 chairs for 21 guests, and I was still the one left standing. I walked back to the kitchen in a daze, my hands shaking, as I pulled a folding chair from the pantry closet. A mismatched, uncomfortable folding chair that I would squeeze in at the corner of the table while everyone else sat in the good dining room chairs that had been in our family for generations. When I returned with the chair, the family had already started serving themselves, passing dishes and filling plates, and launching into animated conversations. Nobody noticed my absence or my return. Nobody had waited for me to sit down before starting the meal I'd spent all day preparing. I wedged the folding chair between Cousin Louise and the wall, the metal frame, scraping against the hardwood floor. By the time I'd served myself, taking small portions from the dishes that remained, my food was already cooling. The mashed potatoes had formed a skin, the gravy was congealing, and the turkey was lukewarm. Around me the conversation flowed like I wasn't there. Talk of football games and upcoming vacations and Brittany's growing social media following. I ate mechanically, tasting nothing, watching my family enjoy the fruits of my labor while discussing everything except the meal itself. "Brittany, you have to tell everyone about the sponsorship deal you landed," Mom said, beaming with pride. "She's going to be the face of that new wellness brand. They're sending her to Costa Rica to film content. It's so exciting," Brittany gushed, pulling out her phone to show photos of the resort where she'd be staying. "They want me to document my entire journey, from the flight to the spa treatments, to the meditation session. It's going to be such incredible content." "And they're paying you for this?" Tia Rosa asked, genuinely curious. "A 5-figure fee, plus all expenses covered. Plus I get to keep all the products they send me to feature. It's honestly a dream come true." 5-figure. For a week-long vacation disguised as work, for posting pretty pictures and inspirational captions, while getting pampered at a luxury resort. I thought about my own bank account, slowly draining as I funded these elaborate family dinners, and felt something bitter rise in my throat. "What about you, Carmen?" Uncle Miguel asked, turning to me with genuine interest. "How's work going? Still keeping those books balanced?" Before I could answer, Dad jumped in. "Carmen's doing great, very responsible with money. She's our practical one." Practical, responsible. Code words for boring, for unambitious, for the daughter who stayed home and took care of everyone else's needs, instead of chasing dreams and building brands, and living exciting lives worth documenting. "I'm actually thinking about going back to school," I said, surprising myself. "For culinary arts. There's a program at the community college that focuses on restaurant management." The table went quiet for a moment, and I could feel everyone's attention on me. It was the first time all day that I'd been the center of focus, and the weight of their collective gaze made me nervous. "That's interesting," Mom said, finally, her tone carefully neutral. "But isn't that a pretty big risk? Restaurants fail all the time, and you have such a stable job now. Plus, don't you think you're a little old to be starting over?" Brittany added, her voice gentle but cutting. "I mean, culinary school is usually for people in their early 20s, right? I was 28 years old, and according to my sister, too old to pursue a passion that had been simmering in me for years, too old to want more than a life of practical responsibility and stable mediocrity." "I think it's wonderful," Tia Rosa said firmly, shooting a sharp look at Brittany. "You're an incredible cook, Mia. You should absolutely follow your dreams, but the moment had passed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The conversation moved on to other topics, and I retreated back into invisibility, finishing my cold dinner while everyone around me enjoyed the meal I'd created. Nobody mentioned culinary school again. Nobody asked about my dreams or my plans, or what I wanted for my future. By the time dessert was served, pumpkin pie and apple crisp that I'd made from scratch the night before, I was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. I was emotionally drained, spiritually depleted, sick of being taken for granted, and overlooked, and treated like the help rather than family. As I began clearing plates, loading them onto the serving cart to take back to the kitchen, Brittany grabbed my arm. "Before you disappear, we need to get a family photo. The lighting is perfect right now." She arranged everyone around the table, directing poses and angles like a professional photographer. "Carmen, you stand in the back by Dad, and Mom, tilt your chin up just a little." "Perfect." I stood where she positioned me, forcing a smile as she set up her phone camera and activated the timer. Through the lens, we looked like the perfect family. Well-dressed, well-fed, gathered around a beautiful table in a beautiful home. No one would ever guess that one person had done all the work while everyone else enjoyed the benefits. "Gorgeous," Brittany announced, reviewing the photos. "These are going straight to Instagram. The aesthetic is just perfection." As the family began to disperse, some heading to the living room for football, others outside to the patio for drinks and conversation, I retreated to the kitchen to begin the monumental task of cleanup. Pots and pans filled the sink, serving dishes covered every surface, and the floor was sticky with spills and crumbs from a day of cooking. I filled the sink with hot, soapy water and began washing dishes, my hands moving automatically through the familiar routine. This was how every holiday ended for me, alone in the kitchen, cleaning up while everyone else relaxed and digested and enjoyed the afterglow of a perfect meal. Through the window I could see some of the family gathered around the fire pit on the patio, laughing and telling stories in the golden afternoon light. It looked peaceful, warm, exactly the kind of family moment I'd been hoping to be part of when I woke up this morning. But I was trapped in here, trapped by duty and expectation, and the knowledge that if I didn't clean up, no one else would. My phone buzzed on the counter and I dried my hands to check the notification. Brittany had posted the family photo with a caption that made my jaw clench. "Grateful beyond words for this incredible family and the traditions that bind us together. There's nothing like a home-cooked Thanksgiving meal surrounded by the people you love most. Feeling so blessed to carry on the legacy of strong women who came before us. Family first, Thanksgiving blessed, gratitude. The people you love most, the traditions that bind us together." As if I were bound to this kitchen, bound to this role of invisible service provider, bound to a life of cooking and cleaning, while everyone else lived and laughed and created memories. I set the phone down and returned to the dishes, scrubbing pots with more force than necessary. The water was scalding hot, but I barely felt it. I was numb, operating on autopilot, going through the motions of the role I'd been assigned since childhood. The kitchen door swung open, and I looked up hopefully, thinking someone had finally come to help, or at least to check on me. But it was just Dad, looking for more ice for his drink. "Great meal, Misha," he said absently, opening the freezer and scooping ice into his glass. "You really outdid yourself this year." He was gone before I could respond, leaving me alone with the dishes and the silence and the growing realization that this was my life. This was what I'd signed up for, year after year, holiday after holiday. I was the family cook, the family cleaner, the family caretaker, and everyone was perfectly happy with that arrangement, as long as it meant they didn't have to do the work themselves. I looked around the destruction zone that had once been my kitchen, at the hours of cleanup that stretched ahead of me, at the window that showed my family enjoying the fruits of my labor without me. And something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to do this anymore. I wasn't going to be the invisible woman who made everyone else's happiness possible while sacrificing my own. I wasn't going to spend another holiday cooking alone, eating cold food, cleaning up while everyone else celebrated. I dried my hands on my apron, untied it from around my waist, and hung it on its hook by the stove. Then I walked to the coat closet, grabbed my jacket and purse and headed for the front door. "Carmen," Mom's voice called from the living room. "Where are you going?" I paused at the door, my hand on the handle, looking back at the family gathered in the warm glow of the fireplace. They looked comfortable, content, unaware that anything was wrong, unaware that I was drowning in resentment and exhaustion, and the crushing weight of being taken for granted. "I'm leaving," I said simply. "Leaving, but you haven't finished cleaning up," and we were going to do the gratitude circle after dinner. The gratitude circle, where everyone would share what they were thankful for while I finished scrubbing pots in the kitchen, where they'd talk about family and tradition and blessing while I single-handedly restored order to the chaos they'd created. "I'm done," I said, and walked out the door. The cold November air hit my face like a slap, shocking me back to awareness. I stood on the front porch for a moment, breathing hard, my heart pounding with the adrenaline of rebellion. I'd actually done it. I'd walked away from my family, from my responsibilities, from the role that had defined me for as long as I could remember. My phone was already buzzing with texts. Mom asking where I was going, Brittany demanding I come back and finish what I'd started, Dad wondering who was going to take care of the leftovers. But I didn't answer. I got in my car and drove away from the house, away from the expectations, away from the life that was slowly suffocating me. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do next. I just knew I couldn't go back to that kitchen, couldn't pretend that everything was fine, couldn't keep being the invisible woman who made everyone else's happiness possible while getting nothing in return. As I drove through the quiet streets of Phoenix, past houses glowing with warm light and filled with families celebrating their own Thanksgiving traditions, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: freedom. Terrifying, exhilarating, absolutely liberating freedom. And for the first time all day, I was hungry for my own life. I drove aimlessly through Phoenix for an hour, my hands gripping the steering wheel as the adrenaline slowly wore off and reality began to sink in. What had I just done? I'd abandoned my family on Thanksgiving, left a kitchen full of dirty dishes, walked away from responsibilities that had been mine for over a decade. The rational part of my brain screamed that I was being dramatic, childish, selfish, but the deeper part of me, the part that had been suffocating under years of invisible labor, felt lighter than it had in years. My phone continued to buzz incessantly from the passenger seat, but I ignored it. I wasn't ready to face the barrage of guilt trips and manipulation that I knew was waiting for me in those messages. Instead, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a small strip mall, drawn by the warm glow of a restaurant that was still open despite the holiday. Torino's Italian kitchen sat wedged between a nail salon and a dry cleaner, its modest exterior giving no hint of the magic that lay within. Through the windows I could see maybe a dozen tables occupied by people who, like me, had found themselves seeking refuge from traditional family celebrations. The thought that I wasn't the only person who'd escaped their Thanksgiving obligations was oddly comforting. I sat in my car for several minutes, watching the easy conversations and genuine laughter happening through those windows. When was the last time I'd enjoyed a meal that someone else had prepared? When was the last time I'd sat at a table as a guest rather than the invisible servant orchestrating everyone else's experience? The decision to go inside felt rebellious in a way that made my heart race. I was supposed to be home, cleaning up the aftermath of the feast I'd created, making sure everyone was fed and happy and comfortable. Instead, I was about to spend money on food that I hadn't made, to sit at a table where my only responsibility was to enjoy myself. The moment I walked through the door, I was enveloped by the intoxicating scent of garlic and herbs, fresh bread and simmering tomatoes. It was everything my mother's house had smelled like this morning, but without the weight of obligation pressing down on my shoulder. Here, these aromas represented pleasure rather than labor, anticipation rather than exhaustion. A woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun approached me with a warm smile. Her name tag read Maria, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd been taking care of hungry people for decades. "Table for one, honey?" she asked, and there wasn't a trace of pity in her voice. Just simple acceptance that sometimes people needed to eat alone, needed space to think and breathe and exist without performance. "Please," I said, grateful that my voice came out steady. She led me to a small table by the window, close enough to observe the other diners, but far enough from the main traffic flow to feel private. As she handed me a menu, she studied my face with the kind of knowing look that comes from years of reading people's moods. "Rough day?" she asked gently. I almost laughed. Rough day felt like such an understatement for the emotional apocalypse I'd just survived. Something like that. "Well, you're in good hands now. Mr. Torino's in the kitchen tonight, and he's got a way of making everything better. Can I start you with something to drink?" I ordered a glass of red wine, something I never would have been able to do at home where I was always too busy serving everyone else to relax with alcohol. When Maria returned with a generous pour of Chianti, I took a sip and felt some of the tension in my shoulders begin to relieve. The menu was a revelation. Simple dishes prepared with obvious care and attention, nothing flashy or Instagram-worthy, just honest food designed to nourish and comfort. After spending the morning creating an elaborate feast meant to impress and photograph well, the straightforward approach felt revolutionary. I was studying the pasta options when a man emerged from the kitchen, making his way between tables to check on customers. He was probably in his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of sturdy build that spoke of decades spent on his feet in professional kitchens. His presence was calming in a way that reminded me of Tia Rosa, that rare quality of making people feel seen and valued. When he reached my table, he paused, tilting his head slightly as he took in my appearance. I suddenly became aware of how I must look, still wearing the nice clothes I'd put on for family dinner, but rumpled now from hours in the kitchen, probably smelling like turkey and exhaustion. "First time here?" he asked, his voice carrying just a hint of an Italian accent. "Yes," I admitted. "I was just driving around and saw your lights were on." "Ah, a refugee from Thanksgiving dinner," he said with understanding that surprised me. "You'd be amazed how many people end up here on holidays. Sometimes family celebrations are more exhausting than celebratory." "No?" The empathy in his voice caught me off guard and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "Something like that." "I'm Vincent Torino," he said, extending his hand. "And you look like someone who needs feeding properly. Have you decided what sounds good?" I gestured helplessly at the menu. "Everything looks amazing. I honestly can't choose. May I suggest something? Off menu, but I think you'll like it." When I nodded, he continued, "I make a very simple cacio pepe, but with fresh pasta that I rolled this morning. Nothing fancy, just good ingredients treated with respect. And maybe some of my wife's focaccia to start." The idea of eating something simple and perfect, prepared by someone who clearly understood the soul-nourishing power of food, made me want to cry with relief. "That sounds incredible. Then, and don't worry about your phone," he added with a knowing smile, nodding toward the device that was still buzzing periodically on the table. "Whatever crisis they think they're having, it can wait until after you've eaten." As he headed back to the kitchen, I did something I hadn't done in years. I turned my phone face down and ignored it completely. For the next hour, whatever my family was dealing with in my absence would have to be their problem, not mine. The focaccia arrived first, still warm from the oven and drizzled with the kind of olive oil that tasted like sunshine and herbs. I tore off a piece and nearly moaned with pleasure. After a day of tasting nothing but stress and obligation, this simple bread felt like a revelation. Food could be joyful again. Eating could be about pleasure rather than fuel for more labor. When the pasta arrived, I understood why Vincent had recommended it. The noodles were silky and tender, coated in just enough cheese and black pepper to let their fundamental goodness shine through. Each bite was a masterclass in restraint and technique, proof that the best dishes often came from respecting simple ingredients, rather than trying to impress with complexity. As I ate, I found myself observing the rhythm of the restaurant. Maria moved between tables with practiced grace, somehow anticipating needs before customers even realized they had them. Vincent emerged periodically from the kitchen, not to perform or seek praise, but to genuinely check that people were enjoying their meal. There was a teamwork here, a shared understanding of purpose, that felt like everything my family dinner had been missing. A couple at the table next to mine was celebrating their anniversary, sharing stories and laughing over glasses of wine and plates of osso. Across the room, an elderly man read a book while savoring what looked like the most perfect bowl of soup I'd ever seen. At the bar, two women who appeared to be longtime friends were catching up over appetizers and cocktails, their conversation animated but comfortable. Everyone here was choosing to be here, choosing to share this space and this food and this moment. Nobody was performing for cameras or creating content or trying to maintain an image. They were just people enjoying good food and good company, and the simplicity of it made my chest ache with longing. My phone buzzed again, and this time I glanced at the screen despite my earlier resolution to ignore it. 17 unread messages, 17 urgent communications about my transgression, my abandonment, my failure to fulfill my assigned role. I could imagine the content without reading them: guilt trips about family loyalty, manipulation disguised as concern, demands that I return immediately to clean up the mess I'd created. But for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel the familiar pull of obligation. I didn't feel the desperate need to manage everyone else's emotions and fix whatever problems my absence had caused. Instead, I felt something that might have been anger, clean and righteous, and absolutely justified. They were upset that I'd left. Where had their concern been when I was cooking alone for 14 hours? Where was their gratitude when I was creating a beautiful meal that none of them had lifted a finger to help with? Where was their consideration when they'd forgotten to save me a proper seat at the table I'd spent all day preparing? Vincent appeared at my table again, this time carrying a small glass of something that looked like limoncello. "On the house," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "You looked like you could use a friend." The unexpected kindness nearly undid me. "Thank you for the drink. And for this." I gestured around the restaurant. I needed this more than I realized. "Ah, the holidays. They can be brutal for people who care too much." He studied my face with the same knowing expression Maria had worn earlier. "Let me guess, you're the one who does all the cooking for your family." I nodded, surprised by his accuracy. "I can always tell. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from feeding people who take it for granted. You have that look, like you've been wringing yourself out for others and forgot that you deserve nourishment too." His words hit so close to home that I had to look away, blinking back tears. Is it that obvious? To someone who's seen it before. Yeah, my wife, God rest her soul, she used to tell me about her sister, spent every holiday cooking elaborate meals for a family that treated her like the help, never said thank you, never offered to pitch in, just expected her to sacrifice herself for their comfort year after year. What happened to her? Vincent's expression grew sad. She had a heart attack at 52 right there in her kitchen, making Christmas dinner. The family was in the living room watching television while she collapsed alone over a pot of soup. He paused, letting the weight of that image settle. They found her when they came looking for dessert. The story hit me like a physical blow. I thought about my own exhaustion, my aching back, the way my hands had been shaking from stress and overwork. How many holidays had I pushed myself past my limits, for people who couldn't even be bothered to help clean up afterward? "I'm sorry," I whispered. "Don't be sorry, be smart. Life's too short to spend it serving people who don't appreciate your gifts." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "You know what the real tragedy was? That woman was an incredible cook. She had instincts for flavor and technique that I'd seen in professional kitchens. She could have done anything, opened her own restaurant, taught cooking classes, written a cookbook, but she spent all her energy making other people happy and never pursued her own dreams." I thought about my own abandoned dreams, the culinary school applications I'd bookmarked but never filled out, the business plans I'd sketched in notebooks and then hidden away. How many years had I spent convincing myself that my family's needs were more important than my own ambitions? "Can I ask you something?" Vincent continued. "What would you be doing with your life if you weren't spending all your time taking care of everyone else?" The question caught me off guard because nobody had ever asked it before. Nobody had ever suggested that my life might have value beyond my utility to others, that my dreams might be worth pursuing, even if they didn't directly benefit my family. "I've always wanted to go to culinary school," I said quietly, maybe open my own place someday, something small and intimate, focused on comfort food, done really well. Vincent's eyes lit up with interest. What kind of comfort food? Mexican-American fusion, I think. The recipes I grew up with, but elevated, sophisticated techniques applied to traditional flavors. As I spoke, I could feel excitement building in my chest, the same feeling I got when I was experimenting with new dishes in my kitchen at home. I make this mold that takes 3 days to prepare properly, and these tamales with duck confit that are absolutely incredible, and my pozole, I use a combination of 3 different chiles, and make my own hominy from scratch. Stop, Vincent said, holding up his hand with a grin. You're making me hungry, and I just finished eating. These sound like dishes that belong in a restaurant, not just family dinners. The validation from a professional chef made my heart race. You really think so? I know. I've been in this business for 40 years, and I can tell when someone has real talent. The way you describe those dishes, the passion in your voice when you talk about technique, that's not amateur enthusiasm, that's professional calling. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through something. Actually, I might have an opportunity that would interest you. I've been thinking about expanding our catering operation, maybe adding some Mexican specialties to our menu. Would you be interested in doing some consulting work, testing recipes, maybe cooking a few dishes for me to try? I stared at him in shock. Was he seriously offering me work, professional cooking work, based on a conversation over dinner? Are you being serious right now? Completely serious. Good cooks are hard to find, and great cooks who understand both traditional techniques and modern applications are even rarer. From what you've described, you sound like exactly what I've been looking for. My phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. The sound seemed to break the spell of possibility that Vincent's offer had cast, dragging me back to reality. I had responsibilities, obligations, a family that expected me to come home and resume my role as their invisible support system. I should probably get going, I said reluctantly. My family is... Well, they're pretty upset that I left. Vincent's expression grew serious. Let me give you some advice. From someone who's seen a lot of talented people waste their gifts. Your family will survive one night of cleaning up their own mess. But if you keep sacrificing yourself for people who don't value what you bring to the table, you'll wake up 20 years from now wondering where your life went. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before handing it to me. That's my personal cell phone. When you're ready to start cooking for people who appreciate your talent instead of just expecting it, give me a call. I took the card with trembling fingers, staring at the simple logo and contact information that represented the first real opportunity anyone had ever offered me to pursue my passion professionally. Thank you for everything. For the meal, for listening, Thank you for reminding me why I got into this business in the first place, Vincent replied. To feed people, to make them feel valued and cared for. You deserve to feel that way too. As I walked back to my car, Vincent's card clutched in my hand like a talisman. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Real, tangible hope for a future that might be different from the endless cycle of service and sacrifice that had defined my adult life. But as I drove home through the dark Phoenix streets, that hope warred with the familiar weight of obligation. My phone had been silent for the last 20 minutes, which somehow felt more ominous than the constant buzzing. Either my family had given up on reaching me, or they were planning something that didn't require my immediate response. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, which surprised me. I'd expected to find the lights blazing, the family gathered in crisis mode to discuss my unprecedented abandonment. Instead, the windows were black and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the main road. I sat in my car for several minutes, reluctant to break the peaceful bubble that my evening at Torino's had created. Out here, I could still feel the lingering warmth of Vincent's kindness, the possibility he'd offered, the sense that my skills might have value beyond my family's kitchen. Once I walked through that front door, I'd be pulled back into the familiar dynamics that had been slowly suffocating me for years. But I couldn't sit in the driveway forever. Eventually, I had to face whatever consequences my rebellion had created. The house was eerily quiet as I let myself in through the front door. Usually after family gatherings, there would be people scattered throughout the living areas, continuing conversations over drinks or coffee, reluctant to let the celebration end. Tonight, the only evidence of the day's festivities was the lingering smell of turkey and the stack of serving dishes that someone had clearly transported from the dining room to the kitchen and then abandoned. I walked through the darkened house toward my childhood bedroom, expecting to find angry notes or evidence of the family meeting that had surely taken place in my absence. Instead, I found something worse: complete indifference. Nobody had waited up to confront me about my behavior. Nobody had left messages demanding explanations or apologies. They'd simply cleaned up enough to make the house functional again, and then dispersed to their own homes and their own lives, as if my presence or absence was ultimately irrelevant. In some ways, this reaction hurt more than anger would have. Anger would have suggested that my departure mattered, that my role in the family was important enough to fight. This silence suggested that they'd managed perfectly well without me, that my years of invisible labor could be replaced or simply abandoned without significant disruption to their lives. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, still wearing the clothes I'd put on 14 hours earlier, with such different expectations for how the day would unfold. My reflection in the dresser mirror showed a woman I barely recognized, rumpled and exhausted, yes, but also somehow sharper around the edges, more present in her own skin. My phone, which had been mercifully quiet during the drive home, suddenly exploded with a series of notifications. Not the angry texts I'd expected, but Instagram alerts. Brittany had posted a series of stories throughout the evening, documenting what she called an unexpected turn in the holiday celebration. The first video showed her in the kitchen, looking glamorous despite the chaos of dirty dishes surrounding her. "So guys, we had a little family drama today," she said to the camera, her voice carrying just the right note of resigned disappointment. "My sister had some kind of breakdown, and Jill left in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner, left all of us to deal with this mess." She panned the camera across the kitchen, lingering on the towers of dirty pots and pans, the food-stained countertops, the general disaster that 14 hours of cooking had created. But instead of looking overwhelmed or angry, she looked energized, like this chaos was exactly the kind of content goldmine she'd been hoping for. "But you know what?" she continued, turning the camera back to herself. "This is what family is about. Stepping up when someone else steps out. So we're all pitching in to clean this up together. And honestly, it's been kind of beautiful. We're talking and laughing and really connecting in a way we don't usually get to do." The next video showed various family members washing dishes and putting away leftovers, all looking remarkably cheerful for people who'd been abandoned with a massive cleanup job. Uncle Miguel was telling jokes while scrubbing a roasting pan. Tia Rosa was organizing leftover containers with military precision. Even Dad was helping, drying dishes and making conversation with cousins he usually ignored during gatherings. They were having fun. Without me, they were actually having more fun than they'd had during the formal dinner itself. The realization hit me like a slap. They didn't need me to make their gatherings successful. They needed me to do the work so they could enjoy themselves. But my actual presence, my participation in the celebration, was apparently optional. The final video was the most damaged. Brittany had positioned herself in front of the now clean kitchen, looking radiant and slightly emotional. "You know what today taught me?" she said to her followers. "That when people show you who they really are, you should believe them. Some people are givers, and some people are takers. Some people stick around when things get hard, and others walk away when they don't get enough attention." The implication was clear. I was the selfish one. I was the taker who'd abandoned my family in their time of need. The hours I'd spent cooking, the years I'd spent serving, the lifetime of invisible labor I'd provided, none of that mattered, because I'd finally reached my breaking point and removed myself from a situation that was killing me slowly. The comments on her posts were overwhelmingly supportive. "You're such a strong person for handling this with such grace. Family first always. Your sister clearly has some growing up to do. This is why I love following you. You show us what real character looks like." I set my phone aside, too emotionally exhausted to feel angry about the way she'd twisted the narrative. Of course she'd found a way to make my breakdown about her strength, my pain about her grace, my absence about her superior character. That's what Brittany did. She took raw material from other people's lives and spun it into content that made her look better by comparison. But something had shifted in me during my evening at Torino. Vincent's words echoed in my mind. Life's too short to spend it serving people who don't appreciate your gift. For the first time, I was beginning to understand that my family's treatment of me wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of their inability to see value in anything that didn't directly benefit them. I pulled Vincent's business card out of my purse, running my thumb over the embossed lettering. Tomorrow I would call him. Not because I was ready to completely upend my life, but because I owed it to myself to explore what possibilities might exist outside the suffocating bubble of my family's expectation. For tonight, though, I was content to sit in the quiet darkness of my childhood room, processing the events of a day that had started with resignation and ended with something that might actually be hope. I'd walked away from a table where I wasn't valued, and instead of the catastrophe I'd expected, I'd found a place where my skills were recognized and appreciated. Maybe Vincent was right. Maybe there were people in the world who would value what I had to offer, who would see my passion for cooking as a gift rather than a service they were entitled to receive. Maybe I didn't have to spend the rest of my life making myself smaller and smaller to fit into a role that had never really been designed for my happiness. The house settled around me with the familiar sounds of old wood and settling foundations. But for the first time in years I didn't feel trapped by these walls. They were still my temporary shelter, but they no longer felt like my permanent prison. Somewhere out there was a life that I'd been too afraid and too obligated to reach for. Tomorrow I would start reaching. The morning after Thanksgiving dawned gray and cold, matching the emotional hangover that settled over me as consciousness crept in. For a moment, lying in my childhood bed with sunlight filtering through curtains I'd picked out in high school, I almost convinced myself that yesterday had been some kind of stress-induced nightmare. But Vincent's business card on my nightstand and the absence of any breakfast smells from the kitchen confirmed that everything had actually happened. I'd walked away from my family. I'd eaten dinner at a restaurant alone. A professional chef had offered me work based on a single conversation. The surreal quality of these events made them feel like someone else's life, but the lightness in my chest told me they were absolutely real. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Mom and a text that simply read, "We need to talk. Come downstairs when you're ready." No anger, no dramatics, just the kind of measured tone that suggested she'd spent the night formulating a strategy to handle my unprecedented rebellion. I showered and dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel competent and adult rather than the comfortable, forgettable outfits I usually wore around the house. If we were going to have a confrontation, I wanted to face it feeling like the person I was becoming, rather than the person I'd always been. Mom was waiting in the kitchen with coffee and what appeared to be leftover turkey, arranged on a plate like some kind of peace offering. She looked perfectly put together despite the late night of cleanup, her hair styled and her makeup flawless, but there was something brittle around her eyes that suggested the calm exterior was requiring significant effort to maintain. "Good morning, Mija," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I made you a plate. I thought you might be hungry." The gesture would have been touching if I hadn't spent the previous day being ignored while I created a feast for 23 people. Now it felt like manipulation disguised as care, an attempt to re-establish the traditional dynamic where she took care of me and I responded with gratitude and compliance. "Thank you," I said, sitting across from her at the kitchen table where I'd eaten countless meals and absorbed decades of subtle criticism. The turkey was dry and flavorless without the accompaniments I'd spent hours preparing, but I ate it anyway, waiting for her to reveal her strategy. "Your father and I stayed up late talking," she began, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug like it was an anchor. "We're concerned about you. Yesterday was very out of character, and we're wondering if you might be going through something that you haven't shared with us." There it was, the reframing that made my legitimate anger into a mental health crisis, my reasonable boundaries into evidence of instability. It was a move I should have anticipated, but the sheer audacity of it still took my breath away. "I'm not going through anything unusual," I said carefully. "I just got tired of cooking alone and then being forgotten when it came time to eat." "Forgotten, Carmen?" That's not what happened. We had a seating mix-up, that's all. These things happen at large gatherings. A seating mix-up, as if 23 place settings for 24 people was some kind of innocent mathematical error rather than a perfect metaphor for my place in this family. As if the fact that I was the one left standing was just unfortunate coincidence, rather than the inevitable result of being consistently overlooked. Mom, I cooked for 14 hours yesterday, 14 hours, and when it came time to eat, there was no place for me at the table I'd spent all day preparing. You're being dramatic. We found you a chair immediately, a folding chair. You found me a folding chair while everyone else sat in the good dining room chair. She sighed, the sound carrying years of practiced patience with what she clearly viewed as my tendency toward overreaction. I think you're reading too much into things. We're family, Carmen. We don't keep score of who does what or worry about perfect seating arrangement. We just support each other. Support each other. I thought about Brittany's Instagram stories from the night before, the way she'd painted me as selfish and attention-seeking, while positioning herself as the long-suffering sister who'd stepped up in my absence. I thought about the family members who'd enjoyed my food without ever asking if I needed help, who'd complimented the meal without acknowledging the person who'd created it. When was the last time anyone in this family supported me? I asked, genuinely curious. When was the last time someone asked about my dreams or my goals or what I wanted for my future? That's not fair. We've always supported you. How? By expecting me to cook every holiday meal alone, by dismissing my interest in culinary school as impractical, by treating me like hired help instead of family. Mom's composure cracked slightly, a flash of irritation crossing her features before she regained control. You're not hired help, you're family, and family means putting the group before yourself sometimes. It means contributing your gifts for everyone's benefit. My gifts, I laughed, but there was no humor in it. My gifts that nobody acknowledges or appreciates unless they're being served at exactly the right temperature with perfect presentation. We appreciate everything you do. Because yesterday, when I mentioned culinary school, Brittany said I was too old to start over. Dad called me practical like it was some kind of consolation prize for not being ambitious enough to chase real dreams. And you warned me about the risks, like I haven't been calculating risks my entire adult life. The kitchen fell quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the street outside. Mom stared into her coffee cup, and I could see her formulating her next approach, trying to find the right combination of words that would restore the status quo without requiring her to actually address any of my concerns. I think you're having some kind of quarter-life crisis, she said finally. It's normal for people your age to question their choices and wonder about alternative paths, but running away from your responsibilities isn't the answer. Quarter-life crisis. At 20, the term was so perfectly dismissive that I almost admired her skill at invalidating my feelings, while making it sound like she was being understanding and supportive. What responsibilities am I running away from? I asked. Your family, your role in this household, the traditions that have been passed down through generations. You mean the tradition of me doing all the work while everyone else enjoys the benefits? You're twisting things to make yourself sound like a victim. Nobody forced you to cook yesterday. You volunteered like you always do, because cooking is your passion and your gift to the family. There was just enough truth in her words to make them sting. I had volunteered year after year, holiday after holiday. I'd taken on the role of family cook gradually, eagerly even, because I loved the creative challenge and the satisfaction of feeding people I cared about. But somewhere along the way, volunteer had become obligation, and gift had become expectation, and nobody had bothered to check whether I was still happy with the arrangement. What if I don't want to volunteer anymore? I asked. The question hung in the air between us like a grenade with the pin pulled. Mom's eyes widened slightly, as if the possibility that I might withdraw my labor had never occurred to her. In her world, family members had fixed roles that didn't change, obligations that didn't expire, gifts that could be demanded rather than offered. Then I guess we'd have to make other arrangements, she said, her voice cool. Though I think you'd regret giving up something you're so naturally talented at. Naturally talented. As if my skills were some kind of genetic accident rather than the result of years of study and practice and passionate dedication. As if the hours I'd spent perfecting techniques and developing my palate were somehow effortless because cooking came naturally to me. Maybe I want to use my natural talent for something that actually benefits me. I said. Maybe I want to cook for people who value what I do enough to pay me for it. Pay you for it? Mom's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. Carmen, you can't build a career on cooking. It's a hobby, not a profession. Not for people like us, working-class Mexican Americans who were supposed to be grateful for stable jobs and modest ambitions, who weren't supposed to dream of owning businesses or pursuing creative careers. People like us were supposed to be practical above all else, to choose security over passion, to serve others rather than ourselves. What if I want to try anyway? I asked. Then you'd be making a very expensive mistake. Do you know how many restaurants fail in their first year? Do you know how hard it is to make a living in the food industry? Do you know how hard it is to make a living doing anything you're passionate about? I countered. At least if I fail, I'll fail at something I care about. Mom set down her coffee cup with enough force to make me flinch. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This impractical thinking, this selfishness disguised as following your dreams. You have a good job, Carmen. You have family who love you, you have a comfortable life, and you want to throw it all away for some fantasy about becoming a chef. Selfishness. There it was, the word that had been hovering around the edges of our conversation, waiting to be deployed. In my family, any desire that didn't directly benefit the group was automatically classified as selfish. Any dream that might require independence or personal growth was seen as betrayal of family values. Maybe I am being selfish, I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. Maybe it's time I started putting my own needs first for once. The words seemed to shock both of us. I'd never spoken to my mother this way before, never challenged the fundamental assumption that my role was to serve others while sacrificing my own desires. But something had shifted in me since yesterday. Since Vincent had looked at me and seen potential rather than just utility. I raised you better than this, Mom said, her voice heavy with disappointment. I raised you to understand that family comes first, that we take care of each other, not to be this selfish person who abandons her responsibilities when things don't go exactly her way. You raised me to be invisible, I said, the truth spilling out before I could stop myself. You raised me to make everyone else comfortable while ignoring my own needs. You raised me to believe that my value comes from what I can do for other people, not from who I am as a person. That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you asked me how I'm doing? Really asked, not just checked to make sure I'm still functional enough to serve my purpose. Mom stared at me like I'd grown a second head. I ask how you're doing all the time. You ask if I'm okay when you need something from me. You ask how work is going when you're making conversation. But when was the last time you asked about my dreams, my goals, my hopes for the future? The silence stretched between us, answer enough to my question. In the absence of her response, I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel something fundamental shifting in the dynamic that had defined our relationship for nearly 3 decades. I think I need some space, I said quietly, some time to figure out what I want my life to look like. Space from what? From this, from being the family cook and the family caretaker and the family disappointment. From having my worth measured by how much I'm willing to sacrifice for everyone else's comfort. Mom's eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of hurt or manipulation. So you're leaving us? Just like that? I'm not leaving you. I'm leaving this role. I'm leaving this expectation that I'll always be available to do whatever needs doing while my own life gets smaller and smaller. Where will you go? What will you do? For the first time since the conversation started, I smiled. I don't know yet, but for the first time in my adult life, I get to find out. I stood up from the table, leaving the plate of dry turkey half finished. I'm going to start looking for my own place. Somewhere I can cook for myself, explore my own interests, build a life that actually belongs to me. Carmen, please, don't make any hasty decisions. Take some time to think about this rationally. I have been thinking about it. I've been thinking about it for years. Yesterday was just the first time I had the courage to act. I headed toward my room to start packing, but Mom's voice stopped me at the doorway. What about Christmas? What about New Year's? What about all the family traditions that depend on you? I turned back to look at her. This woman who'd raised me to believe that my worth was tied to my usefulness, who genuinely couldn't imagine how the family would function without my invisible labor holding everything together. You'll figure it out. Just like you figured out how to clean up yesterday after I left. You don't need me as much as you think you do. You just need my work. The distinction seemed to hit her like a physical blow. For the first time in the conversation, she looked genuinely shaken, as if she was finally beginning to understand that this wasn't a temporary rebellion or a cry for attention. This was me choosing myself for the first time in my adult life. I love you, Mom, I said, because it was true despite everything, but I can't keep loving you at the expense of loving myself. In my room, I pulled out the suitcase I'd used for a handful of weekend trips over the years, and started folding clothes with the methodical precision I usually reserved for food preparation. Each item I placed in the case felt like a small act of rebellion, a step toward a future I couldn't quite envision but was finally brave enough to pursue. My phone rang while I was debating whether to pack my goodnight. Vincent's name appeared on the screen, and I answered before I could second-guess myself. Carmen? I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to follow up on our conversation last night. Not too early at all, I said, though my voice came out slightly breathless. Actually, your timing is perfect. Good. I've been thinking about what you said, about your mole and your tamales, and I'd love to have you come in and cook for me. Maybe this weekend? I can pay you as a consultant, and we can see how your flavors work with our kitchen setup. A paying cooking job. My first step toward the career that Mom had just dismissed as impossible fantasy. I'd love that. This weekend works perfectly. Excellent. And Carmen, I don't know what's happening in your personal life, but if you need any advice about navigating the food industry, or if you want recommendations for culinary programs in the area, I'm happy to help. Good cooks should be cooking, not wasting their talents in situations that don't appreciate them. After hanging up, I sat on my bed surrounded by half-packed belongings and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Excitement about my future. Pure, uncomplicated excitement about possibilities that existed beyond my family's kitchen, beyond their expectations, beyond the suffocating role I'd been playing for so long. There was a soft knock on my door, and Brittany's voice called through the wood. Carmen, can I come in? I almost said no. I wasn't ready for whatever manipulation or guilt trip she'd prepared, whatever content she might be planning to create from this family drama, but curiosity won out over caution. Come. Brittany entered looking perfectly put together despite the early hour, her hair blown out and her outfit carefully curated for whatever Instagram stories she'd be filming today, but her expression was unusually serious, lacking the performative sweetness she usually wore like makeup. Mom said you're moving out, she said, closing the door behind her and leaning against it. I'm looking for my own place, yes, because of yesterday. Because of a lot of things. Yesterday was just the breaking point. Brittany was quiet for a moment, studying my face like she was trying to read something written there. I saw that you were at Torino's last night. Someone posted a photo of you on their story. Of course someone had recognized me. In the age of social media, privacy was an illusion, especially when you were related to someone with 50,000 followers who documented every aspect of their life online. I needed dinner, and they were open. By yourself? By myself. She moved further into the room, perching on the edge of my desk chair with the kind of casual grace that made everything look effortless. I've never eaten alone at a restaurant. I don't think I could handle it. The admission surprised me. Brittany projected such confidence, such comfort with being the center of attention, that I'd never considered she might have her own vulnerabilities. It was actually really nice, I said. Peaceful. I posted about last night, she said suddenly. About you leaving. I probably shouldn't have. This was as close to an apology as I was likely to get from Brittany, and even this much acknowledgement felt significant. I was angry. We all were. It felt like you were abandoning us when we needed you most. When you needed me to clean up the mess from the dinner I'd spent all day cooking. She had the grace to look uncomfortable. When you put it like that, it sounds pretty shitty. It was pretty shitty, I know you do a lot for the family. I know you work hard on these dinners, do you? I asked. Because from where I stand, it feels like you see my cooking as content for your social media, rather than actual work that deserves recognition. Brittany flinched. That's not. I mean, I do appreciate what you do. You appreciate the result. The beautiful food that photographs well and makes your family look perfect online. But you don't appreciate the process, the hours of planning and shopping and prep work, and actual cooking that goes into creating those results. I could help more, she said quietly. I should help more. It was such an unexpected offer that I almost laughed. Brittany, when was the last time you cooked anything more complicated than instant oatmeal? I could learn. I could take some of the burden off you. I don't want you to learn how to help me, I said, continuing to pack while we talked. I want you to learn how to take care of yourself. I want all of you to learn how to function without depending on me to make your lives comfortable and convenient. So you're really leaving? I'm really leaving. And you're serious about this cooking thing? The restaurant career. I thought about Vincent's offer, about the excitement in his voice when I'd described my dishes, about the possibility of turning my passion into something that could sustain me financially and emotionally. I'm serious about finding out what my life could look like if I stopped living it for other people. Brittany was quiet for several minutes, watching me fold sweaters and pack shoes with the same care I brought to everything I did. When she finally spoke again, her voice was smaller than usual. I'm going to miss you. The simple statement, free of manipulation or performance, caught me off guard. For just a moment, she sounded like the little sister I'd protected and cared for growing up, before social media and family dynamics had turned us into competitors for attention and validation. I'm going to miss you too, I said, and meant it, but I'm not disappearing. I'm just going to start living my own life instead of being a supporting character in everyone else's. Will you still cook for us sometimes? For special occasions? I considered the question carefully. Maybe, if I'm invited as a guest rather than expected as the help. If my contribution is valued rather than just consumed, I think I can arrange that. It wasn't a promise, and it wasn't enough to change my decision, but it was something, a small crack in the family dynamic that had been suffocating me, a hint that maybe relationships could evolve if people were willing to do the work. After Brittany left, I finished packing and called Vincent back to confirm our weekend meet. Then I started scrolling through apartment listings online, looking for something small and affordable where I could start building a life that belonged entirely to me. For the first time in my adult life, I was choosing uncertainty over security, possibility over comfort, my own dreams over other people's expectations. It was terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely necessary. The woman who had walked away from Thanksgiving dinner was finally ready to walk towards something better. 3 weeks later, I stood in the cramped kitchen of my new studio apartment, stirring a pot of pozzola that would feed Vincent and his restaurant staff for our tasting session. The space was barely larger than a closet compared to my family's sprawling kitchen, but every square inch belonged to me. No one would interrupt my cooking to ask for favors, no one would critique my methods, and no one would take credit for the final result. The apartment itself was nothing special, a converted garage behind a house in Tempe, with thin walls and temperamental plumbing, but the rent was manageable on my bookkeeper's salary, and the landlord had agreed to let me install a proper ventilation system above the stove. It was the first space I'd ever had that was designed around my needs, rather than someone else's expectations. Vincent had been true to his word, paying me generously for the consulting work and offering genuine feedback that helped me refine my recipes for a restaurant set. More importantly, he'd connected me with other chefs in Phoenix, introduced me to suppliers, and shared the kind of industry knowledge that would have taken me years to accumulate on my own. For the first time in my life, I was part of a community that valued my skills rather than just expecting them. My phone buzzed with a text from Grace Kim, the paralegal who'd reached out after seeing one of Brittany's posts about my breakdown. Grace specialized in employment law, but she'd been following my sister's social media presence with growing concern about how my story was being weaponized for content. Can you talk tonight? Found something you need to see about B's latest campaign. I'd been trying to ignore Brittany's online activities, focusing instead on building my new life and developing my relationship with Vincent's restaurant. But Grace's messages always carried an urgency that suggested I shouldn't dismiss whatever she'd discovered. The pozzola was reaching the perfect consistency, rich and aromatic with layers of flavor that had been building for hours. I tasted it one final time, adjusting the salt and adding a squeeze of lime before transferring it to containers for transport. This batch was destined for tomorrow's staff meal at Torino's, but I'd made enough extra to freeze for myself, a luxury I'd never been able to afford when cooking for my family's constantly changing guest list. My doorbell rang just as I was cleaning the last spoon, and I opened it to find Aunt Patricia standing on my tiny porch with a grocery bag and a determined expression. She'd been the only family member to reach out since I'd moved out, offering support without judgment and checking on my well-being with genuine concern rather than ulterior motives. "I brought ingredients for churros," she announced, pushing past me into the apartment. "Figured you might want some dessert after all that savory cooking." Aunt Patricia had always been the rebel in our family, the one who'd chosen adventure over security by marrying a jazz musician and following him on tour for 15 years before settling in Phoenix. She understood the pull of passion over practicality in ways that my parents never could. "You don't have to cook for me, Tia," I protested, but she was already unpacking cinnamon and sugar, evaluating my kitchen setup with the critical eye of someone who'd cooked in tiny spaces all over the country. "I'm not cooking for you, Misha. I'm cooking with you. There's a difference." We worked side by side in comfortable silence, preparing dough and heating oil while she shared updates about family dynamics in my absence. Apparently, the Christmas planning was causing significant stress without my usual organizational skills and cooking contribution. Mom had attempted to delegate responsibilities, but nobody else had the knowledge or experience to execute the elaborate menus I'd been creating for years. "Your mother called me yesterday," Aunt Patricia said, carefully dropping churros into the hot oil. "Asked if I thought you'd come back for Christmas if they apologized properly." "What did you tell her?" "I told her that apologies only work if they come with changed behavior, that you weren't looking for words, you were looking for respect." The validation meant more to me than she probably realized. For weeks I'd been second-guessing my decision, wondering if I'd overreacted to normal family dynamics, if I'd thrown away relationships over pride and sensitivity. Having someone who knew the situation, confirmed that my feelings were justified, helped quiet the self-doubt that still surfaced in quiet moments. "Have you heard from Brittany lately?" I asked, thinking about Grace's cryptic message. Aunt Patricia's expression grew concerned. "She's been posting a lot about family healing and personal growth, making herself sound like some kind of wisdom teacher who's learned deep lessons about relationships." This matched what I'd observed during my brief scrolls through social media. Brittany had pivoted from documenting my breakdown to positioning herself as someone who'd gained profound insights about family dynamics and unconditional love. Her follower count had actually grown since Thanksgiving, as people connected with her narrative about forgiveness and growth. "She's also been getting some interesting opportunities," Aunt Patricia continued. "Speaking engagements, brand partnerships focused on family wellness. Apparently, your story has become quite profitable for her." The churros were golden and perfect, dusted with cinnamon sugar and still warm from the oil. We ate them standing at my tiny counter, savoring the simple pleasure of food created without agenda or expectation. But Aunt Patricia's words had stirred up the anger I'd been trying to suppress, the fury at watching my pain become someone else's content goldmine. After she left, I called Grace back, settling onto my second-hand couch with a cup of tea and steeling myself for whatever bombshell she'd discovered. "Carmen, I need you to see something, but I want you to promise me you'll stay calm while I explain it." "That's not a promising start to a conversation. Your sister has launched a new business venture, a family healing retreat called Coming Home to Love. She's marketing it as a program for families dealing with difficult members who've abandoned their responsibilities." My blood pressure spiked instantly. "She what?" "It gets worse. She's using your story as a case study. Not by name, but the details are specific enough that anyone who follows her would recognize the situation. She's positioned herself as the family member who learned to love unconditionally despite being abandoned by someone she'd always supported." Grace sent me screenshots as she spoke, and I scrolled through them with growing disbelief. Brittany had created an entire business model around my departure, offering weekend intensives for families dealing with challenging dynamics and members who prioritize personal desires over family unity. The promotional materials were slick and professional, featuring photos of Brittany, looking serene and wise against backgrounds of desert landscapes and cozy home interiors. The copy was expertly crafted to appeal to people who felt victimized by family members' boundaries, who wanted validation for their hurt feelings rather than insight into their own behavior. She's charging $1,500 per family for these workshops, Grace continued, and she's booked solid through next spring. Carmen, she's making serious money off your story. I stared at the website, trying to process the scope of what Brittany had built in just 3 weeks. She'd turned my moment of self-advocacy into a narrative about her own spiritual growth, my healthy boundary setting into evidence of my selfishness and abandonment issues. Is there anything I can do legally? That's complicated. She's not using your name or identifying details, and she's framing everything as her own personal experience and growth, but there might be some options around defamation or misrepresentation, especially if we can prove that people are recognizing you from her description. The worst part was how effective her strategy was. The comments on her posts were overwhelmingly supportive, filled with people sharing their own stories of family members who'd chosen selfishness over love, who'd abandoned their responsibilities when times got tough. Brittany had tapped into a rich vein of resentment among people who felt entitled to others' labor and sacrifice. There's something else, Grace said, her voice growing more serious. She's planning a special holiday retreat in December, healing family wounds during the season of giving. The promotional material specifically mentions helping families cope with empty chairs at holiday tables and the grief of being abandoned by ungrateful relatives. Empty chairs at holiday table. The phrase was clearly designed to evoke sympathy for families like ours, where one member had finally refused to continue serving others at their own expense. Brittany was literally profiting from the narrative that I was the villain in our family story. I need to think about this, I said finally. Can you send me everything you found? I want to see the full scope of what she's built. After hanging up, I sat in my quiet apartment trying to process the magnitude of Brittany's betrayal. It was one thing to post about family drama for sympathy and engagement. It was another thing entirely to build a business around weaponizing my story for profit, while painting me as the ungrateful abandoner. But as I scrolled through more of her content, I noticed something interesting. The comments weren't universally supportive. Mixed in with the validation and encouragement were questions from people who seemed to recognize the other side of the story. Wait, so your sister cooked Thanksgiving dinner for the whole family by herself and then left when there wasn't a seat for her? That doesn't sound like abandonment. That sounds like she was tired of being taken for granted. I'm confused about the timeline here. She spent all day cooking for everyone and then had some kind of breakdown. What exactly did the family do to support her during this marathon cooking session? This sounds like my family, where one person does all the work and everyone else just shows up to eat. Maybe she left because she was exhausted, not because she was selfish. These dissenting voices were getting pushback from Brittany's core followers, but their presence suggested that not everyone was buying her version of events. Some people recognized the signs of a family scapegoat who'd finally reached their breaking point. My phone rang, startling me out of my social media spiral. Vincent's name appeared on the screen, and I answered gratefully, ready for a conversation that had nothing to do with family drama. Carmen, I have news, good news, I think, but I wanted to run it by you first. I could use some good news. I've been talking to my business partner about expanding our catering menu, and we want to offer a Mexican-American fusion option, high-end comfort food for corporate events and private parties. Would you be interested in developing the menu and running that part of the operation? The offer was more than I'd dared to hope for. Not just consulting work or occasional cooking, but actual responsibility for an entire segment of his business, a chance to build something that belonged to me while being supported by his established infrastructure and client base. That sounds incredible, but I should probably mention that I don't have any formal culinary training. I'm completely self-taught. Carmen,
I've been eating your food for 3 weeks. You have better technique and flavor instincts than half the culinary school graduates I've hired. Training can be taught, but passion and natural talent can't be. We spent the next hour discussing details. Vincent wanted to start slowly, offering the fusion menu to existing clients and building demand before expanding.
He was willing to provide space in his kitchen for recipe development and testing, plus access to his supplier network and business systems. In exchange, I'd get a percentage of the catering revenue and the freedom to build the program according to my vision. It was the opportunity I'd been dreaming of without fully believing it could happen. A chance to turn my passion into a sustainable career, to cook for people who valued my skills enough to pay premium prices for them. Most importantly, it was validation that my abilities had real market value beyond the family dynamics that had defined my worth for so long. "There's one more thing," Vincent said, as our conversation wound down. "I've been getting calls from event planners asking about authentic Mexican food for holiday parties. Apparently there's a gap in the market for upscale interpretations of traditional dishes. Your timing couldn't be better." After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the tools and ingredients of my trade, feeling a sense of purpose I'd never experienced while cooking for my family. This wasn't about obligation, or expectation, or performing a role that others had assigned to me. This was about using my skills to build something that belonged entirely to me. But Brittany's betrayal still stung, the knowledge that she was profiting from my pain while positioning herself as the injured party. I thought about the families who would attend her retreats, the people who would learn to see boundary setting as abandonment and self-advocacy as selfishness. How many relationships would be damaged by her twisted interpretation of what had happened between us? My laptop chimed with an email notification, and I opened it to find a message from someone named Jessica Chen, with the subject line, "Saw your sister's retreat promotion. Hi Carmen. I hope it's okay that I'm reaching out. A mutual friend gave me your email after I mentioned recognizing your story in your sister's business promotion. I'm a licensed family therapist here in Phoenix, and I specialize in helping people recover from toxic family dynamics. I've been watching your sister's content with growing concern about the message she's spreading. Would you be interested in talking about ways to provide a healthier perspective on family boundaries and self-advocacy? I think your voice could help people who are struggling with similar situations." The email was like a lifeline thrown into the churning waters of my anger and confusion. Here was someone who recognized the truth of what had happened, who understood that my departure hadn't been abandonment, but self-preservation. More importantly, she was offering me a way to counter Brittany's narrative with something more honest and helpful. I wrote back immediately, agreeing to meet and discuss how we might work together to provide resources for people trapped in similar dynamics. If Brittany was going to profit from our family drama, at least I could ensure that a healthier perspective was also available to people who needed it. The next few days passed in a blur of recipe development and business plan. Vincent introduced me to his catering clients, and the response to my sample dishes was overwhelmingly positive. Corporate executives raved about my elevated pozole, society matrons declared my gourmet tamales revolutionary, and event planners started booking tastings for their biggest holiday parties. For the first time in my adult life, I was experiencing the rush of professional success, the satisfaction of being valued for my skills and compensated accordingly. The contrast with my family role was stark and illuminating. Here, my contributions were celebrated rather than expected. My innovation was rewarded rather than taken for granted. But success brought its own complications. As word spread about my catering menu, food bloggers started reaching out for interviews. Local magazines wanted to feature my story, and social media influencers asked to collaborate on content. The attention was flattering, but it also meant that my conflict with Brittany was likely to become more public. Sure enough, the first profile of my catering business mentioned my departure from family cooking duties, framing it as a bold career pivot rather than family abandonment. The piece was positive and supportive, but it included enough details for anyone familiar with Brittany's content to connect the dots. Within hours of the article's publication, my phone was buzzing with notifications. Brittany had posted a series of Instagram stories that never mentioned me by name but clearly referenced the profile, expressing sadness about family members who choose public attention over private healing, and disappointment in people who weaponize family pain for personal gain. The irony was breathtaking. Brittany, who had built an entire business around our family drama, was accusing me of exploiting our relationship for attention. But her followers ate it up, flooding the comments with support for her grace under pressure and criticism of unnamed family members who clearly didn't understand the value of forgiveness. That evening, Jessica Chen called to discuss our planned collaboration. She'd seen both the article about my catering business and Brittany's response, and she had thoughts about how to navigate the growing public dimension of our family conflict. First, congratulations on your business success. It sounds like you're building something amazing. Thank you. It feels surreal, honestly. I bet. And I also want to acknowledge how difficult it must be to watch your sister profit from misrepresenting your experience. That level of manipulation and exploitation is genuinely damaging. The validation from a mental health professional meant everything. For weeks, I'd been questioning whether I was overreacting, whether normal families really did expect this level of sacrifice from their members. Having an expert confirm that Brittany's behavior was manipulative rather than loving helped quiet the self-doubt that still plagued me. What she's doing with these retreats is particularly concerning, Jessica continued. She's teaching people to see healthy boundaries as attacks on family unity. That's not just wrong, it's actively harmful to people who are trying to escape toxic dynamics. We discussed the workshop series Jessica wanted to develop, designed to provide a counterpoint to Brittany's messaging. Instead of teaching families how to pressure boundary setters into compliance, Jessica's program would help people understand the difference between abandonment and self-preservation, between selfishness and healthy self-advocacy. I think your story could be really powerful for people who are struggling with similar decisions, she said, not as a cautionary tale about family disruption but as an example of what's possible when someone chooses their own well-being over others' convenience. The idea of turning my experience into something that could help others felt like a way to reclaim my narrative from Brittany's distortions. Instead of being the villain in her story of family healing, I could be the hero in my own story of self-discovery and professional fulfillment. But I also knew that going public with my side of the story would escalate the conflict beyond anything we'd experienced so far. Brittany had thousands of followers who'd already been primed to see me as the ungrateful family member. Taking a public stand would invite scrutiny and criticism that I wasn't sure I was prepared to handle. Can I think about it? I asked Jessica. Of course, take your time. But Carmen? You should know that what you did takes incredible courage. You chose yourself when everyone around you was demanding that you sacrifice yourself for their comfort. That's not something to apologize for. After hanging up, I sat in my quiet apartment weighing my options. I could continue focusing on building my catering business, staying out of the public eye while Brittany profited from her version of our story, or I could step forward with my own truth, risking backlash but potentially helping others who were trapped in similar situations. The decision, I realized, would determine not just how this chapter of my life unfolded, but who I was going to be moving forward. The person who stayed small and invisible to avoid conflict, or the person who stood up for herself even when it was uncomfortable and risky. Outside my window, Phoenix glittered in the desert darkness, full of possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. Tomorrow, I would make my choice. The decision came to me while I was preparing duck confit meals for a corporate holiday party, my hands working automatically while my mind churned through everything that had happened since Thanksgiving. The repetitive motion of spreading masa, adding filling and folding corn husks, had always been meditative for me, a time when solutions emerged from the rhythm of familiar work. I was tired of being a character in someone else's story, tired of watching Brittany profit from painting me as the selfish sister who'd abandoned her family, tired of seeing people learn to weaponize guilt and obligation disguised as love. If she was going to build a business around our family drama, then I was going to make sure the complete truth was available to anyone who wanted to hear it. That night, I called Jessica Chen and told her I was ready to move forward with the workshop series. We scheduled our first collaboration for the following week, a presentation about healthy family boundaries that would directly counter the messaging from Brittany's retreat. I also reached out to Grace Kim about documenting everything Brittany had posted about our situation, just in case we needed legal protection later. But first, I had a catering event to execute. The holiday party was for a tech company's executive team, and they'd specifically requested elevated comfort food with authentic Mexican flavor. It was exactly the kind of challenge that made me feel alive, the opportunity to showcase traditional techniques, while creating something refined enough for sophisticated palate. Vincent had given me full access to his kitchen for the prep work, and I arrived before dawn to start the slow process of rendering duck fat and preparing my grandmother's mole recipe. The restaurant was quiet except for the hum of refrigeration units and the occasional sound of early morning delivery trucks in the alley. This was my favorite time to cook, when the world was still asleep and I could lose myself completely in the alchemy of transforming raw ingredients into something transcendent. By noon I had 50 perfectly formed tamales, steaming in massive pots, pozole, simmering with layers of complex flavor, and fresh tortillas keeping warm in cloth-lined baskets. The kitchen smelled like heaven, rich with the aromas of toasted chiles, slow-cooked meat, and fresh herbs. This was what I'd been born to do, and finally I was doing it on my own terms. Vincent appeared as I was plating samples for the delivery team to taste, his expression curious and slightly odd as he surveyed my work. "Carmen, this smells incredible. Can I try the mole?" I handed him a spoon laden with the dark, complex sauce that had taken me 3 hours to prepare from scratch. He closed his eyes as he tasted it, and I watched his face transform with recognition of what he was experiencing. "Madonna mia," he whispered. "This is restaurant quality work." "No, this is better than restaurant quality. This is art." The validation from a chef I respected so deeply made my chest swell with pride. This was what I'd been missing during all those years of cooking for my family: genuine appreciation from people who understood the skill and passion required to create food at this level. The event itself was a triumph. The executives raved about every dish, asked for my card, and immediately started discussing bookings for their upcoming events. By the end of the evening I had 3 new catering contracts and a waiting list of potential clients who wanted to experience my food. But success in the professional realm only highlighted the ongoing drama in my personal life. As I drove home that night, my phone buzzed with notifications from social media. Brittany had posted about her own holiday plans, a carefully curated photo shoot of her preparing what she called healing holiday foods for her upcoming retreat. The irony wasn't lost on me. There she was, posed artfully with ingredients she'd probably never used before, creating content about traditional cooking for people who were paying premium prices to learn about family healing. Meanwhile, I was actually cooking professionally, using skills I'd developed over decades of passionate practice, building a business based on genuine expertise rather than manufactured wisdom. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The number was local but unfamiliar, and I almost let it go to voicemail before curiosity got the better of me. "Carmen, this is Rebecca Martinez from Channel 12 News. We're doing a segment on local culinary entrepreneurs, and your name came up from several sources. Would you be interested in being featured?" A television interview about my catering business. The opportunity was incredible, but it also meant stepping fully into the public eye at a time when my family conflict was already generating online attention. Any profile of my work would inevitably mention my transition from family cooking to professional catering, which would give Brittany more ammunition for her narrative about abandoned relatives. "Can I ask how you heard about my business?" "Actually, it was Vincent Torino who suggested we reach out. He spoke very highly of your skills, and said you had an interesting backstory about transitioning from family chef to professional caterer. Vincent had recommended me for television cover." The gesture felt like a vote of confidence that went beyond our business relationship, recognition that my story was worth sharing on a larger platform. "I'd be honored to participate," I heard myself saying before my anxiety could overrule my ambition. We scheduled the interview for the following week, which gave me time to prepare both my food and my messaging. I wanted to focus on the positive aspects of my journey, the joy of cooking professionally, the satisfaction of building a business around my passion, the excitement of introducing people to elevated versions of traditional dishes. But I also knew that the family drama would come up, and I needed to be ready with a response that was honest without being vindictive. The goal was to tell my story without attacking Brittany directly, to model the kind of grace I wished she had shown throughout this process. Jessica Chen helped me practice potential questions and responses, coaching me on how to discuss family boundaries without sounding bitter or defensive. "Remember," she said during one of our preparation sessions, "you're not trying to make your sister look bad.
You're trying to help people understand that choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. The day of the interview, I arrived at Vincent's restaurant early to prepare the dishes I'd be demonstrating on camera. The news crew was professional and enthusiastic, clearly excited about showcasing local talent and authentic cuisine. Rebecca Martinez, the reporter, put me at ease immediately with her genuine interest in food and her thoughtful questions about my background. So Carmen, tell us about your journey from home cooking to professional catering. What inspired the transition? I'd practiced this answer, but speaking it aloud to a television camera still felt surreal. I'd been cooking for my family for years, really elaborate holiday meals and celebrations, but I realized I was using my skills primarily to serve others without really pursuing my own dreams. This year I decided to take the leap and see if I could turn my passion into a career. That must have been a difficult decision, leaving behind family traditions to pursue professional opportunities. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the chance to reframe the narrative without attacking anyone directly. It was challenging, but I think sometimes we have to choose growth over comfort. My family will always be important to me, but I also needed to honor my own potential and see what I could build with these skills I'd been developing for so long. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, focusing mainly on my cooking techniques and business plans. Rebecca was clearly impressed by the food, and the camera crew captured beautiful shots of my tamales and mole that would showcase the artistry involved in traditional Mexican cuisine. As they were packing up their equipment, Rebecca approached me with a more personal question. Off the record, I've seen some social media posts about family healing retreats that seem to reference your situation. Any comment on that? I'd expected this question and had my response ready. I think there are a lot of different perspectives on family dynamics and what constitutes healthy relationships. My focus is on building something positive with my career and hopefully inspiring other people to pursue their passion. It was diplomatic but honest, acknowledging the controversy without engaging in public conflict. I wanted to be known for my cooking and my business acumen, not for family drama and social media feuds. The interview aired 3 days later during the evening news, and the response was overwhelming. My phone rang constantly with catering inquiries, food bloggers wanted to feature my story, and several local restaurants reached out about collaboration opportunity. The segment had positioned me as a rising star in Phoenix's culinary scene, someone who'd successfully transformed personal passion into professional achievement. But the attention also meant that more people connected the dots between my story and Brittany's retreat business. Social media buzzed with comparisons between her narrative of family abandonment and my focus on professional growth. Some people defended her version of events, but others began questioning whether the difficult family member in her story might have had legitimate reasons for setting boundaries. The turning point came when someone posted a side-by-side comparison of our content, Brittany's tearful videos about being abandoned by ungrateful relatives next to clips from my news interview, discussing the joy of cooking professionally. The contrast was stark and illuminating. Where she appeared to be wallowing in victimhood, I was clearly thriving and building something meaningful with my life. One of these people seems to be moving forward and growing, read one viral comment. The other seems to be stuck in the past and profiting from drama. Guess which one I'd rather learn from? The comment thread exploded with similar observations from people who recognized the patterns of family manipulation, who'd experienced similar pressure to sacrifice their own dreams for others' comfort. My story was resonating with people who'd felt trapped by obligation and guilt, who needed permission to choose themselves over others' expectations. Brittany's response was swift and predictable. She posted a series of stories about family members who choose public attention over private healing, expressing disappointment that some people weaponize family pain for personal gain. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but her core followers remained supportive, defending her grace under pressure. However, cracks were appearing in her narrative. Several people who'd attended her retreats began sharing their experiences online, and not all of the reviews were positive. Some participants described feeling manipulated and judged, pressured to accept blame for family members' boundary setting rather than examining their own behavior. I paid $1,500 to be told that my daughter was selfish for moving across the country for a job opportunity, wrote one former retreat attendee. The whole program seemed designed to make us feel like victims rather than helping us understand healthy family dynamics. These dissenting voices grew louder as more people began questioning the fundamental premise of Brittany's business model. A few licensed therapists even posted responses criticizing her approach, explaining why pressuring people to sacrifice their well-being for family harmony was psychologically harmful. Meanwhile, my catering business was thriving beyond my wildest expectations. The news coverage had generated so much interest that I was booked solid through the spring, with a waiting list of clients hoping for cancellations. Vincent offered me a permanent position as his catering director, with profit sharing and creative control over the Mexican fusion menu. But the most meaningful validation came from unexpected sources. I received emails from people who'd seen my interview and recognized their own struggles in my story, thanking me for showing that it was possible to choose personal growth without being selfish or ungrateful. "Your story gave me permission to set boundaries with my own family," wrote one woman. "I've been the default caregiver for everyone else's needs for so long that I'd forgotten I had my own dreams. Seeing you pursue your passion professionally inspired me to start my own business." These messages reminded me why I'd chosen to go public with my experience. It wasn't about revenge against Brittany, or winning some social media battle. It was about providing an alternative narrative for people who'd been taught that their own needs always came second, that pursuing personal fulfillment was inherently selfish. The final confrontation came in December, just before Christmas. Brittany had organized her most ambitious retreat yet, a 3-day intensive called Healing Holiday Hearts, that promised to help families deal with empty chairs and absent relatives during the season of giving. The promotional materials featured photos of beautifully set holiday tables with obviously empty places, designed to evoke maximum sympathy for families dealing with abandoned traditions. But something went wrong during the retreat itself. Details were scarce initially, but social media posts from participants suggested that the event had devolved into something closer to a therapy session gone bad, with people breaking down and confronting each other about years of family dysfunction. Grace Kim called me with updates as the story unfolded. Apparently, several participants had complete emotional breakdowns when they realized they were paying to be told their problems were their fault. A few people walked out, and at least one woman demanded a full refund after she was essentially blamed for her son's decision to limit contact with her abusive behavior. The retreat that was supposed to showcase Brittany's expertise in family healing had instead highlighted the fundamental flaws in her approach. You couldn't build healthy relationships by teaching people to ignore boundaries and manipulate others into compliance. Real healing required acknowledgement of harm, changed behavior, and respect for individual autonomy. The fallout was swift and decisive. Negative reviews flooded Brittany's social media, several participants threatened legal action, and her scheduled spring retreats began canceling as word spread about the December debacle. The business model that had seemed so profitable just weeks earlier was crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions. I felt no satisfaction in watching her venture fail. Despite everything she'd done, Brittany was still my sister, and her pain was real even if her methods had been harmful. But I also recognized that the collapse of her business was inevitable once people began examining the actual outcomes of her approach. 3 days before Christmas, my phone rang with a call I'd been both expecting and dreading. Mom's name appeared on the screen, and I knew that whatever conversation was coming would determine the future of our family relationships. "Carmen, it's Mom. I was wondering, would you be willing to come to Christmas dinner this year?" The invitation surprised me with its simplicity. No guilt trips, no manipulation, no demands that I apologize for my behavior, just a straightforward request that acknowledged my right to make my own choice. "What would that look like?" I asked carefully. "Well, we've hired a caterer this year, a very nice woman who specializes in traditional Mexican food, and we've made sure there are enough chairs for everyone." I almost laughed at the directness of her acknowledgement. A hired caterer and guaranteed seating, concrete changes that addressed the specific issues that had driven me away. "What about Brittany?" Mom was quiet for a moment. "Brittany is going through some things right now. I think she's beginning to understand that the way we treated you wasn't fair. She asked me to tell you that she's sorry, and that she hopes you'll consider joining us." An apology delivered through a third party wasn't ideal, but it was more acknowledgement than I'd received in the months since Thanksgiving, and the fact that they'd hired professional catering suggested a genuine recognition that my contributions had been valuable rather than expected. "I'll think about it," I said, because I needed time to process what this invitation really meant. "Take your time, Mija. We'll understand whatever you decide." After hanging up, I sat in my apartment considering my options. I could attend Christmas dinner as a guest rather than the invisible servant, eating food someone else had prepared while being treated as an equal family member. It would be a chance to test whether our relationships could evolve beyond the dysfunctional patterns that had defined them for so long. Or I could decline and spend the holiday focusing on my own life and business, avoiding the potential drama and disappointment that might come with giving my family another chance to hurt me. In the end, the decision came down to what kind of person I wanted to be moving forward. Someone who stayed trapped in old resentments, or someone who remained open to growth and change even when it was risky. I called Mom back and accepted the invitation, with the understanding that I was coming as a guest rather than a contributor, and that I would leave immediately if anyone attempted to restore the old dynamics. Christmas dinner was awkward but functional. The hired caterer had done excellent work, creating a menu that honored our family traditions, without requiring anyone to sacrifice their holiday for hours of kitchen labor. I sat in a proper chair at the main table, eating warm food while participating in conversations rather than serving others. Brittany was subdued, clearly struggling with the collapse of her business and the public criticism of her approach. She apologized privately for the way she'd exploited our family drama, acknowledging that her retreat model had been fundamentally flawed. It wasn't the complete accountability I might have hoped for, but it was a genuine recognition of harm and a commitment to do better. The conversation was stilted at times, everyone trying to navigate new dynamics without falling back into old patterns. But there were moments of genuine connection, glimpses of what our relationships might become if we continued working on them with honesty and mutual respect. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how much had changed since I'd walked out of that Thanksgiving dinner just over a month earlier. I'd built a successful catering business, developed professional relationships with people who valued my skills, and learned to see myself as someone deserving of respect rather than just utility. More importantly, I'd discovered that choosing myself didn't mean abandoning everyone else. It meant refusing to accept relationships that required me to diminish myself, while remaining open to connections based on mutual respect and genuine care. My phone buzzed with a text from Vincent about a potential new client, a Food Network producer who was interested in featuring local caterers in an upcoming show. The opportunity represented another step forward in my professional journey, another chance to showcase the skills I'd spent so many years developing in isolation. But tonight, I was content to sit in my small apartment, surrounded by the tools and ingredients of my trade, planning menus for clients who appreciated my work enough to pay premium prices for it. I'd learned that the most important ingredient in any recipe was self-respect, and that the best meals were always shared with people who valued both the food and the person who'd created it. The woman who'd walked away from that Thanksgiving table had finally found her seat at a much better one. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.